Welcome. Settle into a comfortable position. Let your breathing grow steady and allow your mind to drift gently backward in time. Tonight, we are traveling to a place of books, of ink and candlelight, of stern teachers and restless young men. We are going to explore what it was really like to study at a medieval university. At first thought, you might imagine the romance of Gothic architecture. Stone courtyards echoing with footsteps, and the air filled with the murmurs of Latin debates. You may picture scholars in long robes, poring over dusty manuscripts by the glow of a flickering flame. But the reality was far less glamorous. Life for the ordinary student was exhausting, uncomfortable, and often deeply uncertain. Over the course of this journey, we will linger with the daily grind of the students themselves. Examine the story of one of the great thinkers who passed through such halls. Explore a mystery that still lingers in medieval scholarship. Contrast all of this with the lives of the academic elite who lived very differently from their pupils. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let yourself wander slowly into the candlelit, echoing corridors of a medieval university. Imagine yourself arriving in a bustling medieval town. Streets are narrow, lined with crooked timber buildings, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp stone. Somewhere within this maze, tucked between taverns and merchants' shops, is the cluster of buildings that makes up the university. It is not a grand, sprawling campus as you might expect today. Instead, it is scattered across the town. A few lecture halls, some rented houses, a library guarded with suspicion, and a church where much of the official life is centered. You are a student here, perhaps just 14 or 15 years old. For most medieval scholars began their studies in what we would still consider childhood. You have come with little more than a woolen cloak, a wooden writing tablet, and perhaps a few coins sent by your family. If you are lucky, you know some Latin already. If not, you will struggle to catch up, for every word spoken in class, every text read, every debate held will be in Latin. Your own mother tongue will be of no use here. The rhythm of your days is punishing. You wake at dawn to the sound of bells from a nearby church. In the winter months, the cold cuts through your thin blanket, and the dampness of the stone floor seeps into your bones. There is no central heating, and the small fire, if you can afford fuel, it all does little to warm your chamber. Lectures begin early. You gather in a bare hall, the floor perhaps strewn with straw, the air smoky from tallow candles. The master sits at the front, reading from a heavy manuscript. The text might be Aristotle or Augustine or some medical treatise preserved from the ancients. He reads slowly, line by line, explaining each phrase, while you scratch your notes onto wax tablets or parchment scraps. There is no printing press yet, so books are rare, precious, and chained to desks. You cannot take them home. Instead, you must rely on the words you copy by hand, struggling to keep up as your breath mists in the cold air. Meals are plain and repetitive. Bread, thin pottage, sometimes a little fish. Students were often poor, and hunger was a constant companion. Many took on work to survive, serving wealthier scholars, or singing in choirs, or even begging when funds ran low. The rules are strict, yet life outside the lecture hall is unruly. Students often lodged in crowded rooms, sometimes 8 or 10 crammed together, with straw mattresses on the floor. Noise from the streets, fights between town and gown. And the general restlessness of young men living away from home meant nights were rarely peaceful. Still, in theory, silence and discipline were enforced. The university threatened punishment for rowdy behavior, but in practice, brawls, drunkenness, and even riots were common. Illness was ever present. The close quarters, poor diet, and lack of sanitation bred disease. Cold, damp walls were thick with mold. Fleas and lice were constant irritants. When plagues swept through, universities sometimes closed entirely, sending students scattering back to their villages if they survived the journey. And then there were the exams. Unlike today, they did not take the form of papers written in silence. Instead, they were public oral trials, often held in Latin, where a student had to defend propositions against the sharp questioning of a master. The anxiety of such tests loomed heavily over years of study. All of this made daily life a continual struggle. You were expected to memorize vast amounts of material, to speak fluently in a language that was not your own, to live on little food and less comfort, and to endure the constant possibility of violence, illness, or expulsion. And yet, in these halls of hardship, the seeds of modern scholarship were planted. In the rhythm of your lectures and disputations, the medieval university was shaping what we now take for granted as the life of learning. As you drift through this world in your mind, the echo of footsteps on cold stone floors grows faint. And we begin to turn our attention from the anonymous crowd of students to one remarkable individual who walked among them. Now that you have settled into the daily rhythm of a medieval university, let us turn our gaze to one of its most famous students and teachers. His name was Thomas Aquinas. You may have heard his name before, spoken in association with philosophy or theology, but here we will move gently through the stages of his life, tracing the contours of a career that was both deeply human and profoundly influential. Imagine Thomas, born in 1225 into a family of minor nobility in southern Italy. His earliest years were not spent in lecture halls, but in the still, prayerful atmosphere of the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino, where his family hoped he might one day rise to become abbot. The great abbey was perched on a rocky hill, its stone cloisters echoing with the voices of chanting monks. The young Thomas walked those halls in silence, already absorbing the disciplined rhythm of monastic life, but his path would lead elsewhere. At the age of 19, against his family's wishes, Thomas joined the Dominican order, a relatively new group of friars devoted to study, preaching, and poverty. His brothers opposed him so fiercely that they are said to have confined him for a time, hoping to dissuade him. Yet Thomas remained steadfast, patient, and calm. This sense of quiet determination would mark his entire life. From Italy, he traveled north to Paris, and then to Cologne, where he studied under Albertus Magnus, one of the great minds of the era. In Paris especially, he encountered the vibrant, chaotic, and sometimes dangerous life of the medieval university. Paris was the beating heart of European scholarship, where theology and philosophy intertwined with disputes about Aristotle's works, which had only recently been rediscovered in the West. Thomas was not a fiery personality. Counts describe him as large and quiet, sometimes mocked by fellow students for his silence, earning him the nickname the dumb ox. Yet his teacher, Albert, perceiving the depth of his intellect, is said to have replied, "This ox will one day fill the world with his bellowing." His daily life as a student mirrored much of what you have already imagined: cold lecture halls, difficult texts, and endless disputations in Latin. Yet Thomas excelled in this environment. He listened carefully, absorbed vast amounts of material, began to write his own reflections, weaving together faith and reason in a way that would echo down the centuries. Later, as a master himself, Thomas lectured at Paris. Picture him standing in front of a crowded hall, parchment in hand, his voice steady as he read his commentaries on Aristotle or unfolded the layers of his great work, the Summa Theologica. His students, wrapped in cloaks against the chill, would scribble notes in the dim candlelight, trying to capture every phrase. Yet his life was not one of comfort. He traveled constantly, teaching in Paris, in Rome, in Naples, always moving, always carrying the weight of intellectual labor. His health suffered. The combination of long hours, poor conditions, and ceaseless demands took its toll, and there was always tension. His ideas, particularly his bold use of Aristotle, were controversial. Some feared that reason was intruding too far into faith, and at times his writings faced suspicion. Yet Thomas, calm and steady, continued to work, shaping a vision of harmony between human reason and divine truth. In 1274, at the age of only 49, Thomas's life came to a close. On his final journey, summoned to the Council of Lyon, he fell ill and stopped at a monastery. Surrounded by the quiet rhythm of monastic prayer, he slipped away. His body was laid to rest in the Abbey of Fossanova, far from the noisy halls of Paris, but his writings lived on, copied carefully by scribes, read by students, and debated for centuries to come. When we think of Thomas today, we might imagine a towering figure of scholarship. But in his own time, he was simply one among many scholars, working within the same uncomfortable, often inhospitable conditions that shaped every student of the medieval university. What set him apart was not luxury or privilege, but persistence, patience, and a mind attuned to questions that still resonate. And so, as the sound of a quill scratching across parchment fades in our imagination, we turn to another facet of the medieval university world, one not tied to any single person, but to a lingering mystery in the history of scholarship. Let us linger now on one of the more curious aspects of medieval scholarship, the mysteries of the books themselves. When you picture a medieval library, you might imagine rows of shelves and neatly bound volumes. But in reality, books were rare treasures, each one painstakingly copied by hand. To hold a single volume of Aristotle, copied on parchment, was to hold months, even years of a scribe's labor. Many universities possessed only a handful of complete works, chained to desks so they could not be stolen, their pages smudged by generations of hands. But here lies the greater mystery. For centuries, much of Aristotle's writing was lost to Western Europe. His logic, ethics, and metaphysics were known only in fragments, passed down through incomplete Latin translations. The rest of his works seemed to have vanished into the shadows of time. Imagine being a student, aware that a great thinker's words existed somewhere, yet out of reach. You could hear whispers of texts preserved in Greek or in Arabic, but you could not read them yourself. This absence shaped the early medieval curriculum. Scholars leaned heavily on the few works they had, layering them with commentary, building entire systems of thought upon small fragments. And yet, there was always this sense of incompleteness, of knowledge locked away. Then, beginning in the 12th century, these missing texts began to trickle back into Europe. In Spain, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures met, translators worked to bring Arabic versions of Aristotle into Latin. In Sicily, two scholars encountered ancient manuscripts preserved by the Islamic world. Slowly, the lost works returned. The physics, the metaphysics, the politics, and more. Imagine the impact. You are a student in Paris, sitting in a cold lecture hall, and for the first time you hear a master reading passages that no one in Western Europe had heard in centuries. Entire new vistas of thought open before you. The dusty world of syllogisms suddenly expands into physics, biology, politics, and rhetoric. It must have felt like a door opening into a vast and unexpected room. And yet, this rediscovery also caused alarm. Aristotle's works were rich, detailed, and often at odds with traditional theology. Could the eternal truths of faith stand alongside the logical observations of a pagan philosopher? Some church authorities worried that the balance of faith and reason was tipping too far toward reason. Condemnations were issued, forbidding the teaching of certain Aristotelian doctrines. But still, the manuscripts circulated. They were copied, studied, debated. The lost Aristotle had been found again, and his presence reshaped the medieval university. What makes this story so compelling is not just the manuscripts themselves, but the thought of how precarious human knowledge can be. A single war, a neglected library, a broken chain of transmission, and entire worlds of thought can disappear for centuries. And then, through patient copying, careful translation, and sheer chance, they can return again, breathing new life into the minds of students and masters. As you let this image rest in your thoughts, the candlelit chamber, the master reading a long-forgotten passage of Aristotle, the student straining to follow you can feel the slow weight of intellectual history moving in cycles of loss and rediscovery. And with this, we drift toward the final part of our journey, leaving behind the hardships of ordinary students, and even the mysteries of manuscripts. To glimpse the lives of those at the very top of the academic world, the masters and scholars whose experiences contrasted sharply with those of the young men in crowded dormitories. Up to this point, we have walked in the shoes of the ordinary student, cold, hungry, and overwhelmed. But now, let us shift our gaze upward, toward the men who presided over the medieval university, the masters, and the established scholars whose lives were very different from those of their pupils. Imagine yourself no longer as a 15-year-old novice, but as a respected master of theology in Paris, or a professor of law in Bologna. You rise in the morning not from a straw mattress in a crowded room, but from a private chamber, with a servant to stir the embers of your fire. Your gown is not patched and worn, but finely made, a marker of your station. As a master, your days still begin early, but the rhythm is gentler. You lecture in halls where students gather eagerly to hear your words, your authority unquestioned. You hold the manuscript in your hands, a text chained to your desk, but entrusted to you as one of the few allowed direct access. When you speak, your students copy your words carefully, their quills scratching across parchment. Beyond teaching, you are deeply involved in disputations, those structured debates that were central to the medieval university. Yet here, you sit in the seat of authority, pose questions, you guide the discussion, and you judge the quality of the students' answers. For you, these debates are less about anxiety and more about performance, a demonstration of your mastery and intellectual prestige. Your meals are taken not in noisy, overcrowded taverns, but in the halls of colleagues or benefactors. You dine on bread, cheese, fish, sometimes meat, and always with more variety than the average student could ever afford. Wine flows freely, not as luxury, but as expectation. And your evenings might be spent in the company of other masters, discussing theology, philosophy, or the politics of the day. Your income, too, sets you apart. While students scrabble for coins, you are supported by stipends, teaching fees, and sometimes by church offices granted as rewards for your learning. A canonry, a benefice, or a post in cathedral administration might supplement your scholarly income, ensuring that you need not worry about the price of firewood or parchment. And there is influence. Masters of theology in Paris, doctors of law in Bologna, physicians trained at Salerno all carried weight in their societies. Kings and popes sought their counsel. Cities prided themselves on the learning housed within their walls. The scholarly elite occupied a unique position, poised between the spiritual world of the church and the practical needs of society. Yet even for them, life was not without pressures. They were expected to uphold orthodoxy, to guard carefully the boundaries of acceptable teaching. A misstep in doctrine could bring condemnation. Their reputations depended on constant vigilance, careful choice of words, and alignment with the powerful institutions of the church. Theirs was a life of privilege, but also of constraint. Still, compared with the daily struggle of their students, the contrast is striking. Where students shivered in unheated rooms, masters lectured in authority. Where students fought in the streets, masters advised rulers. Where students memorized lines of Aristotle in cramped handwriting, masters debated their interpretations in relative comfort. This duality, the hardship of the many and the privilege of the few, defined the medieval university. It was not a single, unified experience, but a layered world where one's place determined whether the university was a place of hunger or of honor. And so as the bells toll softly in the distance, calling both masters and students to prayer or to study, we reach the end of our journey. You have walked the cold streets of a medieval town, sat in the drafty halls of learning, and struggled with the daily grind of a student. You have followed Thomas Aquinas on his quiet but determined path, wondered at the mystery of manuscripts lost and found, and glimpsed the comforts of the scholarly elite. The medieval university was not a dream of stone cloisters and glowing wisdom. It was a hard, demanding world, where knowledge was fragile and life was often uncomfortable. And yet from those conditions, the seeds of modern learning were sown. As you return now to the present, safe and warm, with the hum of modern comforts surrounding you, reflect for a moment on the contrast. The warmth of your bed, the ease of turning on a light, the abundance of books and knowledge at your fingertips, all of these stand in quiet opposition to the struggles of those young scholars centuries ago. Allow your thoughts to soften, your breathing too slow. Let the images of cloisters, manuscripts, and candlelight fade gently into the background. You are safe here, in this moment, surrounded by ease that those early students could scarcely imagine. And as your mind drifts further, you may find yourself slipping quietly into sleep, carrying with you the faint echo of footsteps in a stone corridor, and the steady murmur of a master's voice, long since faded into history.